Article 50, which allowed member states to leave.
My Lords, this is very exciting for me. Some of you have sat through these Grocott bills many times, but this is my first one. I feel it's a milestone, like getting your first paycheck. You know, your first House of Lords hereditary bills abolition of by-elections bill, or your first kiss, or maybe I should say, in deference to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, your first safety-conscious and careful snog. But I have to thank the noble Lord Grocott. He put forward the argument in a very light-touch, witty and courteous way. And, of course, it's difficult to disagree with the central thrust of what he's saying. It is ludicrous and absurd and whatever that you should be a legislator on the basis of being descended from one of Charles II's mistresses or whatever it is. On one hand, what counts is what works. All sorts of things are irrational. We wouldn't invent them today, but we keep them. I was struck by the fact that many of the arguments that the noble lady Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town made against the hereditary principle would work equally well against the monarchy, and yet there's broad support, as far as I can see in the country, for keeping a system that works. But more pertinently, if we are being consistent in our application of these rational principles, then, as my noble friend Lord Lilly has just said, the whole composition of this chamber is indefensible, ludicrous, absurd, and all of the epithets just applied by the noble Lord Grocott. After all, what is the function of Parliament? What are we here for, in an elemental sense, right? It's not to debate in this chamber, it's not to sit on committees, it's not to go on parliamentary delegations. The fundamental purpose of the legislature is to hold the executive to account. And it must be debilitated in that role if one of the two legislative houses is appointed by that executive. And it seems to me that that fundamental indefensibility is why we are debating this at all. The existence of the hereditary peers, the 92, and of the by-election process was precisely intended to be the pebble in the shoe, the thing that drew our attention to the indefensibility of concentrating these powers in the hands of one person, and thereby ensuring that we moved to a completion of Stage 2 reform. And by the way, the idea that we've heard in this debate that the real problem is size, and that if only we could trim the numbers and getting rid of the by-elections would be one way of doing this, that would make a difference. Again, it is intrinsic in having an upper house appointed by the Prime Minister that is going to keep growing. I mean, that is the reality, my friends. If a new Prime Minister comes in, he or she is going to want a majority, and therefore is going to make use of the extraordinary patronage powers that he has under the existing dispensation. In fact, I sometimes wonder whether the whole country isn't going to end up here, sooner or later. People often quote in this chamber the Gilbert and Sullivan line about the House of Peers doing nothing in particular and doing it very well. But I wonder whether an apter song might be the one from the Gondoliers about everyone becoming a peer and dukes being 3 a penny. Perhaps the long-term plan is to put almost the entire country here and then concentrate real power, real oligarchic power, in the hands of the last few hundred people who still retain the right to vote for another place. But I don't see how we can get out of that constant growth unless we tackle reform properly. My noble friend Lord Lilly recalled the sequence of events that led to the deal. And I wasn't around, but some of you were. I think the noble Lord Grocott was involved. You know, Tony Blair came in. This was still a largely hereditary and overwhelmingly Conservative chamber. He had a perfectly good and justifiable case for wanting change. William Hague, as I recall, was not a big fan of the hereditary principle himself. He said, I don't mind change, but it has to be to something better. We can't end up in a situation where you, the Prime Minister, can appoint whomever you like. And Blair said, well, no, we'll do Stage 1 first and then we'll get around to that. And Hague said, well, I don't really trust you correctly, as it turned out, because here we still are. But if we want to change the indefensible element of the by-elections, then we have to be consistent and change the indefensible element of having a House appointed by the head of the government of the time. And that, it seems to me, I'm very open-minded about how we do it. You know, I'd settle for a lengthy non-renewable term. I'd settle for a partly elected element. I'd settle for the selection by lot that my noble friend just proposed. But almost any system is surely better than one where we already have this huge quango state where the head of government can appoint whom he likes. And the idea that it's delayed and therefore the deal is defunct, that isn't how contracts work. This contract was deliberately designed to have in it this correction mechanism that would hasten the end. Now, we can wait often for a long time. What was it that our Lord said about his second coming in Matthew 13:30, if I recall? Verily I say unto you that this generation shall not pass till these things be done. Right? We're still waiting for these things to come about after 2 millennia. There can often be a delay, but if we are serious about making this change, it must be to something that is appreciably and demonstrably better. I personally, and this always goes down very badly on all sides, I personally favour an elected chamber, but I am open to almost anything that would be a permanent settlement. What I'm not open to is going back on the deal in order to try and preserve a fundamentally indefensible status quo. Either we believe in keeping our word or we don't. Pacta sunt servanda.
My Lords,